What's up guys, Rotozap here, and today we're going to be doing something that's pretty interesting, I guess you could say kind of new for my channel, because it's going to be in a very different format than anything I've ever done before. But we're going to be talking about what I think is the best way to go about making a strategy, right? A methodical plan, a way that you can actually step by step track your progress as you go through and make a brand new strategy. And you don't just necessarily have to use this for a brand new strategy. If you're just trying to hone your skills with an existing strategy, you can skip a couple of the opening, planning phases, right, where we're establishing our strategy, and skip right to the suggestions I make for how to go about deck building and testing. So yeah, but as you can see here, we have three categories. We've got a gimmick, pet stat slash pet stat changes, and an archetype. So pet and stat changes are in italics, and they're linked to an archetype and a gimmick because both of these will almost always involve changing your stats or pet in some manner. So I think that they are linked. But just because you're using a new strategy doesn't mean it has to involve going down this crazy path of it being a gimmick or an archetype. It could just be switching some gear out for other pieces of gear, or maybe putting a new pet on, right? So I think that that's probably where I'm going to start with this video, and then move into the gimmicks next and the archetypes. This is going to be a very long video, so I will be putting timestamps in it. So if you already know what kind of strategy you're going for, you can kind of just skip to there. But I will be explaining the differences between a gimmick and an archetype after I go over the stat and pet changes. So really, I mean, it's kind of a dead end with this path. It's just very simple questions that you ask yourself when you're changing your stats or pet. It's what's gained, what's lost, and is giving X up worth Y? And X and Y in this situation could be a lot of different things. It could be trading a single piece of gear for another piece of gear. It could be trading a pet talent for another talent, or it could be an entire gear setup for another entire gear setup. But in any case, you want to kind of tally up everything that you're gaining, all the stats that you're improving on, and tally up all the losses. And by doing this, you can kind of get a much more, I guess, I don't know how to describe it. It's just you see a lot more clearly the changes that are actually occurring with your stats. So if you do this, you're going to get a better understanding of where you stand. And of course, some people would ask, well, how do I know which stats are worth giving up, which aren't? Is giving up 5 damage worth getting 3 resist? Things like that. Generally speaking, you're going to find out answers to those questions when you enter the testing phase of your new stats or your new strategy. So don't worry so much if you're not too good at picking out those things yet. As you become more of an experienced player, you'll start to understand more what stats really mean in relation to each other. But it does vary by school, right? So I would take Ice for example, right? Ice, I'd say the 2 most important stats on an Ice Wizard right now in PvP are your health and your resistance. So if you're giving up a little bit of damage to gain health or resistance, that is an okay trade, because you're getting a stat that is worth more to that school or that strategy, and maybe giving up something that isn't worth as much, because in the case of Ice, you can kind of fill in your damage by using a bubble or blades. So different schools have different weights, I guess, associated with the stats and how much they really need them or how much they don't. So you just got to ask yourself, what are my most important stats? What are my least important? And obviously, if you're getting more important stats and you're giving up less important stats, that's a good thing, right? So that's really all I've got to say about pet and stat changes. We'll talk a little bit more about this as we get into some of the deeper parts of gimmick and archetype. But for now, I think that's probably all that needs to be said. So first, let's talk about the differences between gimmick and archetype in case you're confused about which your idea falls under. So typically a gimmick revolves around small decks. It's a giant combo that either works or it doesn't. They're typically pretty quick games because you either get your combo off and you win the game, or you don't and you lose. Whereas an archetype they're longer games. I mean, this is just kind of a strategy that is meant more to be a template instead of a specific combo in mind. The other really good thing I could say to put it in perspective is playing a gimmick strategy is playing against yourself, because you don't really care what your opponent's doing as long as it's not putting you in immediate danger or doing something that cancels out part of your combo. you don't really care what they're doing. Your goal is to get everything in your combo set up so that you can win the game. Whereas an archetype is more flexible because there's more nuance to it. You're not just trying to set up a particular set of cards. And, because of that, it again makes it more flexible. So if you can't get off plan A, an archetype will typically have a plan B and a plan C, right? So it's not just, you're not just automatically out if you don't get your initial combo off. But a gimmick isn't like that, right? Gimmick decks are only made to pull off the gimmick, the combo. So if they can't achieve this, they just lose. It's really just as simple as that. So hopefully that puts it more into perspective of like what type of strategy yours is. For example, an example of a gimmick strategy would be something like, I just posted a video of my legendary balance where he was doing a judgment strategy with a one-line deck. That's a gimmick. If I can't get my full pip judgment off and it doesn't kill, I just lose, because my deck isn't really equipped to play a long game. So, but an archetype on the other hand would be something, maybe using balance again as an example, would be something like the aggressive balance setup, I guess you could call it, where you're just spamming mana burns, maybe putting up some blades so that you can Mockenspiel effectively, things like that. That's an example of an archetype, right? Because there's not any particular combo you have in mind. You're just going to be doing balance things, right? You're just going to be whittling them down with your mana burns, your Mockenspiels, things like that. So I think out of which one of these sides of the tree I want to venture down first, I think we're going to choose gimmick because I have more fun talking about gimmicks, to be honest. And generally when people make a new strategy, it's not an archetype, it's a gimmick. So, because making a brand new archetype is a pretty big undertaking. So let's just start off with gimmick here. And the first questions that you want to ask yourself is, what is your combo / setup? So what exactly is your combo? For, again, using my judgment example, my combo is setting up a bunch of traps and then doing a full pip judgment. That's my combo. So you need to have a particular combo or setup in mind that is going to be able to pull off this one shot. And sometimes it's not always a one shot, but most of the time it's going to be. The next question you got to ask yourself is, what is your damage cap? And a damage cap essentially means, what is the maximum amount of damage you can do with a reasonable amount of setup? And of course, in the absence of resistance. So optimally, right? Optimally, you're hitting into an opponent with no resistance. That is your damage cap. So it's important to figure out your damage cap because, let's say your damage cap with your strategy is only, and of course we're talking about max level here, but if your strategy was for max and you're only hitting about 8k for your damage cap, that's not going to be a viable strategy because most people have above 8k health. So unless you have a 2-hit, like a bam bam kind of thing, you hit them with the 8k, then you hit them with something that maybe does 2k, it's going to be pretty difficult to actually make that work. So it's important that you find out your damage cap. And then of course the last question is, how many hits does the strategy require? Gimmicks are strategies that are playing against the clock. You are on a ticking timer to get your combo off. Because again, you're playing pretty recklessly generally with a gimmick because you don't really care what your opponent's doing. You're just trying to get your combo set up because if you can do that, you win. So you play more recklessly because that's just what you can do with a gimmick. So if your strategy requires more than like 2 hits, it's probably not going to be viable because that's just too much time. You're not going to have that much time in a game to actually think about and consider making like a 3-piece combo hit. Like that's just not going to work. Typically it's 1 hit, suboptimally 2 hits, but I wouldn't really go above 2 if I were you. Now tree kind of splits for a second here. Now again, we're going to try to weed out a bad strategy immediately. That's kind of the goal of phase 1. So we're going to be asking more questions, right? Again, how do your stats need to change? So for this gimmick, what new gear do you need in order to make this happen? The next question is, what sort of pet will you need? What kind of pet do you need to make? And then finally, what TC are needed? Sometimes, again, we're not really going to worry about like tech cards or one of TC or things that you put in for specific matchups. We're not going to worry about that till later, but sometimes with the strategy, you automatically know you're going to need TC of a certain type. For example, with the Judgment strategy, I know I'm going to need Shatter, I know I'm going to need Pierce, and a couple other TC. So these are things that I take inventory of before I go any further. And then on the other side of the tree, the right side, we have, am I doing enough damage with a reasonable setup? Okay, don't fall into the hole of, you know, just saying, well, I could always just put like 2 more feints on him and I'd be hitting the damage cap I need. No. if you can't, with a reasonable setup, do enough damage, it's not going to be a viable setup. That's just how it is. So if you feel like you can't, then you're going to have to scrap the strategy almost immediately. Now, of course, if you still feel like you are, we will still try and get you out of that hole if you're in it. If you're unknowingly in the hole already, we will make an attempt to rescue you again later. But for now, let's just continue, right? So, oh, and here's another thing too. If your initial hypothesis on damage was wrong, how do you change it? Okay, so, you know, let's say I was originally thinking my damage was going to be 10.5k, which is generally enough to kill most players. I mean, it wasn't. It ended up being 9. Okay, but what do I need to do to change it? And then, of course, when you ask yourself what you need to do to change it, you circle back to the original question: is, am I doing enough damage with a reasonable setup? Because you need to constantly be asking yourself, is what I'm doing reasonable? Is this something that I can actually repeat in a game? So once we ask ourselves these questions, then we get to the last questions that we have for phase 1, which is there too much work or farming involved to make the strategy happen? So is the gear you need either physically unobtainable, or is the pet really difficult to make because it doesn't exist, so you'd have to make it from the ground up? And is it really all worth it just for a gimmick strategy? Because at the end of the day, sure, a gimmick strategy can work and it can get you rank, but it's not something that you're going to hopefully rely on as a way of getting rank or as a way of playing. So, you know, it's really up to you to determine, okay, how much do I really want to make this happen? But it is worth asking yourself if too much work is involved in making the strategy happen. Another question is the final setup process for your combo still within reason? Okay, after we've maybe modified our hypothesis here, after we've maybe changed how we do things, are we still within reason, right? Are we still doing things in a way that we can actually set up on time and actually get our combo to go off? And a very important question is, will you die before the combo is pulled off? And that's kind of a follow-up to this previous question here, but you need to wonder, like, I mean, if I'm playing really aggressively to set up my combo, am I giving myself enough time to get it off before my opponent just kills me, right? You need to consider hyper-aggressive schools like Fire and Storm that can just right out the gate be pressuring you with damage. Can you get this off fast enough, or do you have a way to deal with Fire or Storm that can allow you to get it off in time? But if you've made it this far and you haven't scrapped your idea yet, congratulations, because we're on to phase 2, okay? And when we get to phase 2, it's again more weeding, okay? We're going to figure out, we're doing more thought experiments to figure out if your strategy can really hold up. So the first ones I always ask myself in phase 2 are, what counters my strategy, and can you counter the counter? Or essentially, what can you do to fix the counter? And the suggestions that I make here are, list all the counters that you have on a piece of paper, and then next to them write ways that you think you can beat that counter. Like, for example, if you think that, you know, let's say maybe you're doing a feint stack strategy, okay? So that would be a huge counter to your feint stack strategy would be anyone that plays in Power or Dark Pact or anything like that. So how can we counter the counter? Well, maybe we play Death Dispel so that before we start setting up our feints, we put a Death Dispel on them so that it's really hard for them to get it off, because typically, you know, that's only going to, like, in Power or a Dark Pact, that's only going to probably be a 1 or 2 of in any side deck. So the odds that they pull it and that they actually get to use it are pretty low. So maybe including a Death Dispel is a way to counter the counter. But moving on, are there any hard counters to the strategy? Now, a hard counter is something that, like, just instantly loses you the game. It destroys the combo immediately. Let's say you're a legendary player. Okay, at that level, you can't Aegis your blades, right? So if you're doing something that revolves around blade stacking, a hard counter to your strategy would be anyone with Enfeeble, so Storm, or Myth with Earthquake. Those are hard counters to your strategy. You can't really do much against that because it just destroys your strategy immediately. And then the other question you got to ask yourself is, are there school matchups that are just by nature difficult, right? So if you're doing something that maybe I guess in the context of a gimmick, it wouldn't really make sense. But an example of like an inherently bad matchup, Ice versus Life, gimmicks aside, right, just as a school matchup, is an inherently bad matchup for Ice because they're both pretty tanky schools, but the Life player has the advantage because they can actually heal, whereas the Ice cannot, making it just an inherently poor matchup for the Ice player. So after we've kind of assembled a list of these counters and figuring out which of those are hard counters, now we got to ask ourselves another question before we move on to phase 3. Is the strategy still viable? Again, once you've given enough thought to an idea that you've made it this far, it can be kind of hard to scrap it. I totally get it. But you don't want to waste your time any further with it if it's not going to be viable. So, if your strategy is getting hard countered by things that are really popular in the meta, it's probably not the best time to unveil that strategy. Maybe it's better for a different time. And that kind of leads into my next question, is this a meta that doesn't oppress the idea? So, maybe your idea isn't bad, but it's just not quite right for the current meta, For example, I had an idea on my balance to be using a 5-piece Dragoon set because it was giving me 10k health, and 10k health balance sounds insane. But I was only getting about 50% resistance, and even though I was like 2-0 to start things off, as soon as I hit a Fire Wizard, I realized how horribly bad it is just to have 50 resist. It just doesn't work. Against aggressive schools like that, you can't have 50 resist, or you just don't do enough damage to don't do enough damage to outdamage them. Yeah, that's just how it is, right? But if our strategy is still viable, if we believe that the meta, it's the right time for it, then we can move on to phase 3, which I'll let you know is the second to last phase in this whole thing. So it is now time to begin actually planning out the deck and gear setup that we're going to be using for the strat. So starting from the left here, we're going to begin planning, right? What will your main deck need? What kinds of cards will you need in your main deck? What do you want to see on a draw from your main deck? And similarly, what do you want drawn from side? In this current time, because pre-enchanted hits are banned, your main deck is going to have to include your hits. That's just how it is. Unless your strategy somehow uses a not pre-enchanted TC, then maybe you draw your hits out of side. But generally right now it seems with gimmicks, and keep in mind December of 2020, right? Generally how it seems with gimmicks at the time, it seems like usually your utility is going to fall in your side deck, and most of your main deck is just going to consist of like the raw basics, like the things that you just want to have in your hand at all times because it's your hit, or it's a stunt, like it's just things like that, right? Because you want to have a small deck if you're doing a gimmick, generally speaking. So the next logical step too is to do practice matches either against yourself or a friend to see how the deck is actually drawing in action, and of course make adjustments as needed. So this is really important, and I'll be honest with you guys, this is something that I can get a little lazy with, and maybe I skip this step, I don't know, but I promise you, if you do ample practice with your deck setup before, very rarely will you ever find yourself in a situation where you're doing your first ranked match with your brand new strategy, your brand new everything, and oh my god, the deck draws horribly, right? If you do practicing before, just to see, and I'm not even necessarily talking about playing the game, right? I'm not even necessarily talking about like a practice game. I'm just talking about going into a practice match so you can observe, how is my deck drawing? Am I getting my combo pieces? Because the whole point of a gimmick deck is you want things extremely streamlined, right? You want things as just smooth, flowing as possible so that you can get all your combo pieces in order fast, because if you don't, you just lose. So really important that you do practice matches just to see how the deck draws. Then, of course, now we're going to also begin writing what gear will you be using, what are the pet and the pet stats you'll be using. It's a really good idea to either write down or put in an Excel spreadsheet what gear you're using and the stat totals that you're going to have with that gear. If you don't have all the gear that you need, create a plan. How are you going to farm for it? What is the most efficient way that you can farm for the rest of the gear that you need? And finally, this is extremely important. Never, never, never enter the arena until you've achieved the desired stats. Okay? It's so tempting. Trust me, I've been there. It's very tempting when you're not quite there yet, but you want to start peeving. I get it. We all want to do it, but just don't. Because number one, you're probably going to take a loss because your stats aren't ready yet. Or maybe you don't take a loss, who knows. But it can totally ruin the experience for you if you don't take the time to actually get everything you need. It's just like, I don't know. It's kind of like walking outside without all your clothes on. It's like, sure, you can put a shirt on and socks and, God forbid, underwear, right? And think, you know what? I'm done. I want to go outside now. So then you go outside and it doesn't end well, okay? Same thing can be said for the arena. It's like if your stats are not complete yet, you're kind of walking in without pants on. And Diego doesn't want you to walk in without pants on. So just don't do it. All right, so now we're going to converge before we enter to phase 4, okay? Now that we've done our planning and we've kind of written out exactly what we want out of our stats, we've created a base deck and a base stat is achieved. It's time for the big brain part, okay? What gear and techs do you have for bad matchups? So obviously we wrote down our bad counters and our things, hard matchups, things like that. Okay, what are we going to do with those? How are we going to fix that? I already gave the example of like a feint stacking strategy, packing Death Dispel. Okay, that's an example of that, and that's what we're going to be doing for hopefully all of your bad matchups or, hard strategies that are against you. But it goes more than just TCs sometimes, because it can also be pet stats or even gear that you can use that are maybe better suited for a matchup. Like, for example, if you're having trouble surviving long enough, then maybe putting something on like a higher health, higher resist piece of gear instead of maybe one that does more damage, as long as you're still hitting your damage cap, could be a way for you to make adjustments so that you're not dying as fast and you can actually get your combo off. And then, of course, I already have here, what kind of TC or main deck utility cards can you include to deal with hard and soft counters. Don't think that it's like just limited to TC. You can include things in your main deck from most schools that will help you against your harder matchups. So don't think that it's just limited to TC, and also don't think that it's just limited to cards. You can do things with your gear too that help modify everything, like that help modify your matchups. So, but again though, if we're changing our gear around, you got to kind of circle back to the first points I was making about, is it worth giving up this to gain Y, right? Worth giving up X to gain Y. Got to ask yourself that every time you make a change to your gear. But guys, we've made it pretty far, okay? We're like 24 minutes into the video, and we're finally entering phase 4. And yes, phase 4 is what you think it is. We're going to actually start doing fun things now with our setup. But hopefully at this point in time, if you fell into any of the typical pitfalls with making a strategy or any of the typical logical fallacies that are associated with coming up with a strategy, hopefully by answering all these questions, we've gotten you out of that hole, right? Because the strategy at this point is either viable or it's not. So hopefully you're there, right? And if you've made it that far, it's time to begin testing. So you may find that the strategy after all this planning works fantastic, right? But even with the very in-depth amount of planning that we've done so far, it's still possible for things to go wrong. It's totally possible for you to make a miscalculation, a misjudgment, a wrong prediction. There's a lot of things that could go wrong. And it doesn't mean that you're bad. It doesn't mean that you're not good enough to make a new strategy. It doesn't mean any of that. Okay? You just got to go back to the drawing board. So if you play a couple matches, realize, okay, I clearly misjudged this, or I need this changed pronto. Okay? We just go back to phase 3, right? Because phase 3 is kind of the tinkering phase. It's hammering out all the dents. It's getting out everything that could be a little bit of problematic, a little problematic for our strategy, and just kind of, hammering it out, perfecting it so that when we get to phase 4, everything's working great. So, like I said, phase 2 and 1 were really more dedicated to trying to get a bad strategy off the table immediately. And then we got to phase 3, which is, again, just hammering out the dents, just the little problems that may come from it. And you may find out, too, that in phase 4, you just can't hammer out those dents. So you may keep going back to phase 3 and realizing, you know what, I keep trying to counter this, and I just can't, and I keep seeing it in the ladder. I can't do anything about it. I'm going to have to retire the strategy. And that's not a failure on your part. It just may not have been good for the meta, but if you come up with a strategy that, honest to God, like if you come up with something that really does make it to phase 3, just keep it in the back of your head, because that's a strategy that probably has a decent chance of working in a different meta, in a different time. So keep that strategy in the back of your head, because it may work later on. But I think now we're going to jump over onto the archetype side of things, where we're going to be talking about, I guess, what you could call is the more complicated side of making a new strategy. All right, so jumping over onto the archetype side, we have a whole different set of questions that we need to be asking ourselves as we go through this. So, kicking things off, how is what you're doing different? So, obviously, our archetypes are pretty established. I mean, when new gear and new spells come out and stuff like that, that's typically when an archetype is most malleable. But generally speaking, they're pretty set in stone after that gear is out for a while. So if I were to relate it to our current situation where, Caramel's been out for a while now, archetypes are pretty established at this point. How is what you're doing with your archetype actually different than what currently exists? And this is kind of a cynical question, but if it really is a new way to play, why hasn't it been found? Why is what you're doing new and special? And why, what is it, right? And again, that may sound kind of harsh or mean, but archetypes transcend being a gimmick. They are templates. They are things that are used for months and months and months. So why is your new thing an archetype, right? So moving on, what exactly is your strategy? So again, this kind of plays off of what we previously asked, but what exactly is your strategy? So if I were to ask you, what is your strategy, how would you answer, right? If I were asked that question about, I keep using balance as an example, but you guys know I love balance. So if you ask me about my max level balance, who is doing just your very typical aggressive balance archetype, if you ask me what exactly is my strategy, I would tell you that my goal is for my pet to use punishment on me to be giving me passive damage, and then I'll be using mana burn and supernova to do chip damage over time on the opponent, and then maybe close things out with a really strong shadow hit, or going into strike and spamming other hits or something like that, right? That's my general goal. That's how I kind of plan on winning the game. If you'll notice, that's a very different rhetoric than what we say when we're doing a gimmick, because a gimmick is like, I do A, then I do B, then I do C, then I do D, and then I win. An archetype's different. It's just not like that. It's kind of like, well, I kind of plan on doing these things, but I also kind of want to do this, and maybe if this doesn't work, I have this in my... So it's kind of just a little more complicated, right? And playing an archetype is more difficult than playing a gimmick, because playing a gimmick strategy is pretty brainless for the first part, because you know exactly what you need to counter, and you have all the cards you need to counter your counters, hopefully. and you just do it. It's kind of like opponent does this, okay, my answer is this, right? And that's just how simple it is. But an archetype can be a lot more different because they're typically flexible. So stemming out from this, oh, and of course the last point I want to make too is begin thinking in terms of cards and gear, not ideas. So what exactly does that mean? Start thinking of like specific cards that you want to use to achieve your strategy instead of like an idea. An idea would be, I want my fire wizard to be using overtimes to win a game. Okay, cool. Don't we all, right? Thinking in terms of cards is, I want to use spells like Nautilus Unleashed, Power Link, Fire Wyvern, and Fire Elf to pressure my opponent with overtimes and win the game. That's thinking in terms of cards, not gear. Or in terms of cards, not ideas, right? So moving on here, we've got our little stem in our logic tree, and we're going to ask ourselves, what gear and what pet will we need to accomplish this? And is the gear and pet that you can use flexible? Or in other words, can you swap out pieces without ruining the strategy? And just if the answer to this is no as a whole, maybe that's a red flag for your strategy, because that might mean it's a gimmick more than an archetype. But and not that being a gimmick is bad, but I just trying to get you guys to follow the correct tree here. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, but it's just kind of like, if you can swap out a few pieces and maybe can't swap out others, that's okay. But generally speaking, the whole point of an archetype is that it's flexible and you should be able to make adjustments as needed. So jumping over to the other side, I've said the word template a lot, right? Is it a template? Is this something that we can take and expand upon later? And can it flex to adapt in a shifting meta? Again, this is important because an archetype typically is something that is going to last for months. So is this something that as the meta changes, it changes? And that's good. Again, rigid strategies tend to be a gimmick, not an archetype. So if everything you're doing has a rigidity to it, maybe start looking towards the gimmick side of things, because again, archetypes are typically more flexible. Like I said, using the balanced aggression example, right, with the mana burns and the pops and all that, okay, that I can swap out gear and it's not really going to ruin the strategy. I can also kind of change up the gear, or not the gear, I can also kind of change up what my main deck packs and the text that I have, and it's not going to ruin the strategy. So and some people might even argue that an archetype is a non-strategy, but I think it is, because again, you do have a goal in mind for how you intend to kill someone. It's just not as laid out, as cookie cutter as a gimmick is. So after we combine these two things together, we got to ask ourselves before moving on to the next phase, does your strategy actually improve or modify the current strategies for your school? And again, a more cynical question, is there any point to what you're doing? This is something you got to ask yourself, because whether or not something has a point is completely subjective, right? It's totally subjective whether or not you think this brand new way to play has any meaning. But if your strategy just involves making life more difficult for you because it's either as good or worse than existing archetypes, and you're not really having any more fun playing it than you are the other strategies, maybe scrap it, because it doesn't really seem like a good idea to do. Because I think the two factors that go into making a setup worth it is the ease of getting rank, so how fast can you rank up with it, and how much fun do you have playing with that setup. So it's not a big deal if you're a for fun player, and maybe you're not going to get as much rank with this archetype, but you're going to have a lot more fun playing it. That's totally okay. Again, we play the game how we want to play, and rank isn't everything in PvP. So it's really just what you want to do, but you got to ask yourself before moving on to the next phase, am I actually really doing anything substantial here, or am I just making a lot of work for myself for no reason? So if you've made it past that, we're going to move on to phase 2, where we have more questions. So do your current unfavorable school matchups carry over to the new strategy? So, obviously most schools just have inherently bad matchups, and some strategies in particular of those schools also, they themselves also have bad matchups. So, If you're doing that, do those same disadvantages carry over to the new strat you're using? It's something you really got to consider. Are there now schools that have a better matchup over you than before? So not only are you asking yourself, do they carry over, but am I getting new ones? Like, are there now schools that have an easier time to deal with me? If you're adding more weaknesses than you're taking away, is it really worth it, right? And usually the answer is no. But if you're making your life harder by making more unfavorable matchups, it's just, that doesn't really seem like a good idea, right? Now, of course, I didn't list it here, but you could, of course, gain new good matchups. So that's another thing to keep in mind, is that it is possible, too, by playing a different archetype, you can have a better matchup against something that maybe you didn't before. So again, the tree splits off here, and we're going to ask ourselves on the left, if you gain any new bad matchups, what can you do to counter them? Is there a way to counter them? How relevant are those new matchups? Is this something that you're going to see literally all the time in the ladder? Or is it kind of like a one-off thing, like, oh, there's a really slim chance I might encounter a Dark Nova death, but if I do, I'm totally cooked, right? Like, that's the kind of question you got to ask yourself. And then, of course, just how winnable is that matchup? Is it something that is kind of like 50-50? It depends on who plays better. Is it totally unfavorable for you? Or is it like a lost cause, right? And these are the things you got to ask yourself when you're trying to weigh how your new weaknesses play a factor. So on the right, we have, if you lose bad matchups, can you still include previous counters? So do you still have those counters available to you, or do they not work with your archetype? The other interesting thing to include too is if you now have a favorable matchup against a school that you didn't previously, how favorable do you want to make it? That's always a very interesting question, because it's like, you could, in theory, just set ultra hard and like stomp that strategy out into the ground. And there is actually precedent for doing that if the strategy in particular is a very, very popular one. So for example, if you had a really good way to deal with ice and it doesn't involve you sacrificing too many other stats or deck slots, it might be worth it to do that, because ice is like running rampant right now. Like, you are going to encounter an ice wizard with relatively often occurrences. So it could be worth it to really kind of seal the deal with certain matchups like that. So you got to ask yourself how you want to set that up, of course. And then finally, bringing everything together from phase 2, we're going to weigh out the differences in your predicted matchup changes. And again, huge emphasis on the word predicted, okay? Because we are going to be making a lot of predictions and a scary amount of assumptions in these thought experiments, whatever you want to call them, right? So you got to kind of ask yourself, okay, how many matchups am I losing? How many am I gaining? What is the weight behind those? Give greater weight to a school or strategy that is more common. And of course, like I was just going over, matchups don't mean everything, but you want to avoid every game feeling like an uphill battle. A matchup, again, does not determine the game, but you don't want to have an archetype that involves you having a poor matchup against most schools, because then it's just going to feel like every single game you have to outplay the opponent to win. It feels like a chore. It feels like, an uphill battle. It's like PvP hard mode, basically. So if that sounds enticing to you, I promise you when you get down to it, it's not going to be enticing anymore. But, maybe that's for you. I'm not going to say whether it is or isn't. But if you've made it this far and you don't feel like you need to scrap your strategy yet, congratulations, because we're moving on now to phase 3, where we're going to hammer out some of the final problems that might be involved in the strategy and make things work the best we can, so that when it comes down to phase 4, we're going to be set up with a very solid basis. So now that we've entered phase 3, we're pretty sure at this point that we have a decent idea on our hands. We're going to start putting together a base gear and deck setup. Don't worry about the text quite yet. Use this step to focus exactly on what you need for the strategy, okay? Don't worry so much yet about okay, how am I going to counter this? How am I going to counter? Just focus on putting only what you need in the main and side deck. Only, no text, no nothing, no shenanigans. and a base gear set that is going to work for you in a base pet, right? So again, this is kind of like, it's a weird way to think, but put it together as if you're not fighting anyone. Put it together as if there's no school matchups. It's just everything is even. So, it's kind of a weird way to think, but just don't include tech cards. Don't think about bad matchups. If you're wondering if you should include a card or not, and you just know it's a horrible matchup, sure, or like a bad addition for a matchup, don't include it, sure. But don't worry about adding additional cards as tech cards quite yet. So, if you watch the video all the way through, or you watch the gimmick side of things, this section is going to appear very, very familiar to you, the begin planning and begin writing phases. But we're going to put a little twist on this because how you do things with an archetype is different than how you do it with a gimmick. So what is your main deck going to need? And again, this is all to create our base deck setup. So typically archetypes have larger decks. So it is an important question to think about things like, okay, what are my drawing probabilities of certain things in my main deck? Because I'm obviously going to have to put more copies of things in that I need more often. Because again, typically you're going to be having higher copies of things in these archetype decks. And then of course, what do you want to be drawn from side? Now in this meta where you can't pre-enchant hits, that's almost always going to be utility spells. But I mean, there could be a situation where you put in some sort of non-pre-enchanted TC hit. So these are things you got to consider, is like, is that useful for my strategy, or do I want to stick with, just having hits in my main? And another thing too is like, ask yourself what kind of, I call them engines. I don't really know like a better way to put it, but think about like what you want your shield engine to be and your stun block engine. So what I mean by this is, do you either want to be drawing shields out of your main, your side, or both? Generally, I recommend in this current time side, but there is totally an argument to be made for why it would be both, or I don't think just main. Don't put all your shields in main. That doesn't really make sense. But definitely there could be an argument to be made for both. And in fact, on most characters, I do include it both. Not necessarily for tower shields, but when it comes to set shields and other things, I will typically include a few of those in my main deck. That's always a good idea because you can Aegis enchant those. So yeah, you got to ask yourself, what kind of engine am I going to be running on for my shields? And same with stun blocks. Do I want stun blocks to come out of my side deck, or do I want to pull them out of main deck? And usually for stun blocks, I recommend main and include a lot of copies of them, because then your chances of drawing them on the first or second turn of the game are really high. And later in the game, they can be used as discard fodder to draw out of your side easier. So, and then again, the exact same advice I gave in the last one, do practice matches against yourself or a friend just to see how the deck draws. Like, you don't have to play out the game, but just, figure out how the deck is drawing. Are you getting things in the order that you were hoping? Are you maybe clunking up a little bit? Do you need to maybe include a little more of something, or maybe a little less of something? Because you'll notice I did specifically tell you guys, don't put in tech cards until you have a base deck done for archetypes. And there's a reason for that, right? Because if your deck doesn't work at a base level, it's not going to work with tech cards. Surprise, surprise. So we do this first as a base step because we want to make sure our deck is solid before we actually move on to including tech cards. And then on the other side of this too, we're going to, of course, want to keep track of what gear we're using, what pet we're using. It's a good idea to write down what your total stat distribution is going to be. So how much damage will you have, how much resist, etc., etc. If you don't have all the gear you need, how are you going to get it? And then, of course, exact same advice that I gave in the other one. Do not, under literally any circumstances, enter the arena until you've achieved the desired stats. Just don't do it. You're going to lose rank. You're not going to have a fun time. Again, like, we're putting so much work into this. You're watching this long video. Just do it. Like, if you're willing to put in the work so far, just see it through. Simple as that. I literally can't stress it enough. Like, obviously, I just want to help you guys. Like, I'm very passionate about that because I've been a PvP noob before. I've gotten a little too excited. I've entered the arena and taken some losses I probably shouldn't have taken just because of the gear. So just have it all done before you actually do it. And then finally, before we move into our testing phase, phase 4, don't get too giddy yet. I know everyone wants to enter phase 4, but just hold your Diegos, okay? Now we got to ask ourselves, now we've got our base deck. We've got our base setup. What kind of techs do we have planned for the poor matchups? Again, if you have a bad matchup against, fire or storm or something, what are you doing to improve it? Do you have Aegis Shields in your deck? Do you pack a Dispel to their school so that if they go into Strike, they get punished? What are you doing actively to improve your bad matchups? And a question you got to ask yourself as well is, do you just accept a poor matchup, or do you come up with a way to fight it? And it seems like, the answer inherently should never be accepted, but there is a case to be made for why you would accept a poor matchup. If your poor matchup is something that just almost never shows up in the ladder, it's a very uncommon strategy, it might be worth it to devote your resources elsewhere and not so much plan for that matchup, because there's only so much realistic planning that you can do for bad matchups. So you want to prioritize the bad ones before you get to the, maybe more iffy ones. Now, the other question too is, since we have a bigger deck usually, will you really draw into these texts that you're including? Is it worth the inclusion? Because sometimes, yes, even if it's just a one-of copy, it is 100% worth including, because it is going to single-handedly win you a matchup. Sure, that is definitely worth it. But there are some times where maybe it's a more iffy matchup. You think, oh, maybe I can just throw a card in here. If you have doubts about it, don't include it. Simple as that. Because we're going to be testing, right? So don't include it for now. And if you realize later down the road that you need it, include it. Simple as that. Just super simple, easy. Don't include things that you are on the fence about, because you can always put them in later. And of course, and the reason I say that too is because it's worse to put something in and have it not be useful than not to have it and need it in the testing phase. In the ranked phase, when you're actually doing real ranked games, that is totally not the case. But when you're just testing things, it's a lot better to see that you need something and not have it, as opposed to not being able to do testing well because you're clunking up with something that you don't need. So, and finally, before we move on to phase 4, what are you sacrificing stat-wise if you're using a pet or gear made to deal with a particular matchup? Again, this kind of goes all the way back to the beginning with the is giving X worth Y? You got to ask yourself, okay, if I'm hyper-teched for this one matchup, is that really worth it? Should I really be doing that? Because I'm losing a ton of stats, and now all my matchups across the board are significantly worse, and maybe I only am a little better off against that one matchup I teched for. Just blatant teching is not always a good idea. You got to think about, how are my matchups across the board going to be affected by teching for one particular one. But, guys, okay, we've made it to phase 4. If you've made it this far in the video, thank you. Seriously, thank you, because that's shocking. But I really hope you guys are enjoying this so far. But phase 4 is the exciting part, because this is where we actually begin testing. So it's crucial for an archetype in particular that you test it against a large variety of schools and strategies. You may find that certain matchups are easier or harder than expected. So you may have thought that, oh, my trap stacking fire matchup was really easy on paper, but then you actually play out the game and it's like, oh, I lose pretty bad to trap stacking fire. So, you got to figure these things out by testing, doing practice matches. Hopefully you've got some friends or know some people that are willing to do sparring games with you, just to test things out. Usually people, if you have a pretty interesting archetype and you're testing it out for the first time, usually people are pretty down to test it with you, because they're curious to see how their strategy stacks up against yours. So it's not usually that hard to find testing partners, but you do want to get a big variety of them and really use that to hammer out some of the kinks that may be in your strategy. But another question you got to be asking yourself through it all as you're testing things is the same question we asked previously. Is there any real point in me doing this? And honestly, as long as there's a reason of any kind, there's not a problem. It doesn't matter if you're doing it for fun, for getting rank, whatever. As long as you're personally getting something out of it, it's viable. And no, oh no, slow down. No, as long as you're getting something out of it and it's viable in the meta, it's totally worth it to use. I don't see any reason why you shouldn't go for it. If you're only going to lose with it just because it's not viable in the meta, I would advise against it, even if you have fun doing it, because, I mean, you know, there's usually a fun strategy that you can use that's at least going to have you winning half of the time or most of the time. So I would advise against a losing strategy for very obvious reasons, even if it's fun. And who knows? Maybe it'll become the new meta strategy, right? Maybe your archetype will become the archetype for that meta, or an archetype for that meta, I guess is a better way to put it. So who knows, right? Who knows? You could be the next Wizhead. That's what we'll call it, is the next Wizhead. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video today. The last thing I wanted to say before I close this out is that obviously this video took quite a bit of work to make. So if you enjoyed it, make sure to leave me a like. Make sure to leave me a comment too, because I will be answering as many comments as I can with questions about this, because I love teaching people and I love helping people understand a different way of looking at things, I guess. And I think that I have a pretty unique perspective when it comes to building a strategy. So if you have any questions about me, or maybe not a Q&A in the comment section, but if you have any questions regarding strategies, or, you know, just anything, I guess, feel free to let me know in the comments, and I will answer it. So yeah, but I again just hope you guys enjoyed this. But that's all I've got. Enjoy the rest of your day, guys. Stay tuned for more content, and Rotozap out. Peace.